Today we're going to begin our discussion of the living world, which is in essence an investigation of ecosystem ecology and community ecology. And in this particular episode we're going to focus to a good degree just on the topic of what is referred to as the ecological niche. But let's go back and take a look at these definitions I've got here. We could define an ecosystem as a physical environment and populations of species that this physical environment supports. A community we can define as simply a collection of species living in a particular location. Now, traditional thinking is that communities of species are actively involved in interaction with each other. And although species within a community may interact, many decades of research on this topic has illustrated that that's not always the case. Species may interact, but they may simply live together in the same location without doing a lot of interacting. It depends a lot on the specific set of conditions present in the ecosystem and on the individual ecologies of the species involved. So let's start our discussion by taking a look at an old friend of mine. This is me a long time ago, during my student days, putting a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service aluminum band on the leg of a little bird called a Louisiana water thrush. This is one of the species that I did my doctoral studies on. And what I was after in this study was understanding the nature of this species' ecological niche. I wanted to compare this species' niche with that of its very close relative, which, as it turned out, lived in the same location as this one. They were co-inhabiting a number of locations, and the question was, how could these two very similar species live in the same area? Were they occupying the same niche? And I studied that issue for the better part of 8 years. 3 years during my doctoral time and then a bunch of years afterwards. So let's take a look further at what I mean by all this niche stuff. So we can define a niche like this: the range of conditions that a species occupies in nature. And this range of conditions can be that which is simply tolerated by the species, but we can also think of it in terms of which range of conditions does it prefer. If we think of this notion of niche graphically, then we can talk in terms of amplitude. Just like you talk about amplitude of a wave, what is the range of conditions? What is the amplitude of conditions that you could graph, let's say, on that XY graph that you see at the bottom of the page? On that one, we're looking at the ecological amplitude of the blue-gray gnatcatcher, a different species of little bird, with respect to what kinds of forest type does it use. Does it use mostly deciduous forest, mixed, or conifer forest? And if you study that graph, for example, you'll notice that the ecological amplitude of the blue-gray gnatcatcher tends very much toward deciduous forests, and you don't find too many of them at all occupying conifer forests. Now, we can also introduce a couple other terms here, which are related to these ideas: the fundamental niche and the realized niche. The realized niche is that range of conditions that a species actually winds up using, whereas the fundamental niche is the complete amplitude of conditions which a species is capable of using. So the realized niche is a subset of the fundamental niche, if you want to think of it in mathematical terms. And much of this stuff is very much mathematical in the way it's analyzed in research. So let's go back to my old friend here. This species, again, is the Louisiana water thrush. In North America, it tends to be a species that is distributed primarily through the southeast, although it has, over the past 100 years, made inroads into the northeastern part of the continent. It is usually associated with moving streams. It's a wetland bird. And it, in those kinds of environments, feeds mostly from the ground on leaves along streams, in the water itself. Notice that it has big broad white stripe over its eye, and that its breast is also rather white with those tan speckles on it. Now let's compare it to its close relative. Now this species is the northern water thrush. Notice that he's a bit greener than the last one, and from his name, as you might expect, he's also more northerly distributed across the continent, occurring in southern Canada and into the northern parts of the US. Now, if you look at individuals of these two species, however, you can find ones that are quite similar in appearance. You can find rather white northern water thrushes and rather green Louisiana water thrushes. They flirt with being what is called sibling species, species which have identical morphology, that is, their external appearance is very similar, and yet they remain separate species based on genetic grounds and behavioral grounds and presumably ecological grounds. But that was the issue that I came to study, was were they really different ecologically? So let's consider that point further. In southern New England, the ranges of these two species overlapped, and in places like this deciduous swampy area with a stream running through it, the two species co-occurred. Now traditionally the Louisiana water thrush was thought of as a stream bird, and the northern water thrush was thought of as a swamp bird, but in swampy stream areas, there they both were together, flying right past each other, feeding in the same pools of water, building nests on the same upturned roots. Notice that root upturned on the right hand side of this picture. That's the kind of places where they can build their nests. Or in swamp hummocks and things like that. It was very curious. They also occupied places, most typically of all like this, conifer swampy areas with streams running through them. Being more of a northern species, the northern water thrush really liked those conifer kinds of areas, but so did the Louisiana water thrush. And so when I studied their habitats, when I mapped the territories of these species and studied their habitats, no matter what habitat dimension I looked at, shrubbery, the ground, what kind of water there was, what kind of trees there were, they were overlapping in these categories by 80 and 90%. When I looked at how they fed from the same kinds of areas in very similar kinds of ways. There was, again, an enormous amount of overlap in what they were doing. Now, this posed a problem. Traditional thinking in ecology for many decades was that no two species could occupy the same niche. If they did occupy the same niche, they would have to come into competition with each other. And one species, it was predicted mathematically, would have to prevail over the other and drive it to extinction. And yet here these two species were living together very happily, apparently so at least. And so I continued to look at other kinds of things. How might it be? And so I actually went to the step of capturing individuals and putting them in a flight cage right in these swamps and looking at what they ate in them. Actually watching which bugs they were picking out of the water. And when I did that, I did find some subtle differences. Northern water thrush average is a little smaller than the Louisiana, and it was indeed choosing prey that on average was smaller. It also tended to prefer certain kinds of food that were a little different from what the Louisiana water thrush was picking. But even then, when I looked at the overall pattern of what they were eating, although there were some statistical differences, they weren't all that different. So here I was looking at a situation where two species were, for all intents and purposes, occupying the same niche. And so, how could one explain that? Well, this niche theory idea, this idea that species can't do that, is based on the idea that there is something to compete over, that there is some limited resource. But yet, if you look at these swampy habitats that they were living in, these are highly productive habitats. And we'll talk more about productivity at a later time. But these were areas that were producing, in short, lots of food. And so in that kind of a situation, there wasn't something to compete over. And that allowed them to have extremely similar niches, even though they were separate species. You can think of this situation as the exception that proves the rule. Species can't occupy the same niche without coming into competition only if there is something to compete over. Now, despite all that, it is very common within communities of organisms to find that species that are ecologically similar to each other do tend to still find ways to divide up niche space, you could say. The available kinds of ways of making a living is a simpler way to say that. And here's an example of that from the deciduous forests of the eastern part of North America. The red-eyed vireo is one of the most abundant bird species found throughout much of the eastern part of the continent. And it is morphologically and in a number of other ways quite similar to another species, the warbling vireo that you see in the lower photograph here. Notice in that upper photograph that the red-eyed vireo really does have red eyes. So these are birds that are about the same size. They have very similar kinds of beaks, indicating they're eating similar ranges of food sizes. They're both pretty much forest birds. They're similar in a lot of ways, and yet in this instance there is a fundamental difference between their niches. The red-eyed vireo is a bird of the interior forest, by and large, whereas the warbling vireo really specializes on occupying forest edges. You find them along rivers. You can also find them in shade trees in towns. Similar kind of a place where you have trees, but then you have an edge. Red-eyed vireo is much less frequent as a bird around town. You really think of them as being a bird of the deep forest. So that's a typical kind of an example of the kinds of ecological subdivisions that species make in their environment. Back in the 1950s, the eminent ecologist G. Evelyn Hutchinson of Yale University asked the rhetorical question, why are there so many kinds of species? Well, we can answer that question by considering the message of the last slide. There can be many species if there are many niches, if every species specializes on a particular kind of a lifestyle. And typically when we look at communities, we have a number of specialized species. By being specialized, species avoid competition. Now let's consider these ideas further within the context of the entire community. Take a look at these graphs. If we consider all the species that live within a community, we can compute a term called species richness, which is simply the sum of all the species present. People often use the word diversity for that term, but traditionally in ecology, diversity means something a little bit different. So let's stick with the term species richness. If we look at how many species occupy habitat, we can see that this can change due to a variety of different factors. But before we consider what some of those factors might be, let's consider where the data in those graphs come from. They are part of a long-term study that I completed just a few years ago, which concerned the distribution and population densities of forest birds in southern New England. This was a summer and winter study, and you can see me out here surveying birds in the wintertime in northeastern Connecticut. I was studying species like this one, the tufted titmouse, along with all the other members of the forest community. This was a notable one, though, because it occurs in the forests year-round. It isn't necessarily that it is in the same places and in the same numbers year-round, but the species itself is present year-round. So one of the things that I was interested in was, how is it that all these species are distributed across the landscape throughout the course of the year? What kinds of habitat factors influenced how many species occurred where? So, how did species richness vary among seasons with respect to factors like temperature? So now we can return to these graphs. I think we can all agree that here in the temperate zone, temperature varies quite a bit seasonally. It's cold in the winter and it's warm in the summer. And so an interesting question to ask is, how does that one factor influence species richness? So in this case, species richness is the dependent variable, and the independent variable in this relationship is temperature. what we see when we make that comparison is that in the summertime, across 50 study sites, there isn't a lot of relationship between temperature of the study site and how many species you find. In contrast, in the winter, there was quite a strong relationship. As winter temperature declined across these study sites, fewer species were present. And it's interesting to hypothesize why that might be. My interpretation is that the coldest study sites in the winter cost the birds that live there more calories to survive every day. Hence, there are fewer species that are able to do that. However, in nature, there isn't simply one habitat factor that varies. There are a whole multitude of them. So let's see what happens when we consider two habitat variables. In this graph, we have two independent variables affecting species richness. We can examine the habitat factor of season, and we can contrast summer versus winter, and we can also examine region, what geographic location we are in. So in this case, I compared an inland location, northeastern Connecticut, to a coastal location, southeastern Connecticut. Now when we do that, what we see is that there is an interaction between those two factors. In the summertime, there is not much difference between northeastern and southeastern Connecticut in terms of species richness, but in wintertime there is. In this instance, there are more species inhabiting the forests of southeastern Connecticut than northeastern Connecticut. So this qualifies as an interaction. The failure of a response, which in this case the response is species richness, to be the same when one factor is held constant and another is varied. If we take a look at the distributional patterns of an individual species, it helps to clarify where that species richness temperature relationship comes from. It also helps to explain the relationship between species richness, region, and season. Now this is a map of the distribution of that friend of ours, the tufted titmouse, as it occurs in eastern Connecticut. So the top part of the map is the Massachusetts border, the right side of the map is the Rhode Island border, the bottom part is Long Island Sound, and the left side of the map is the Connecticut River. So the dark parts of the map are the areas where tufted titmouse in summer reaches its highest density. The lightest part, the white parts of that map, are the places where it reaches its lowest density. Notice in the summertime it has a little area of low density in the northern part of the map. This is also the region of most mountainous terrain in eastern Connecticut, so that's an interesting thing to note. Now let's take a look at the distribution of the titmouse in the same region in the wintertime. At this season, the tufted titmouse largely clears out of northern parts of the region. So you see that much of that northern region is now white, low density populations. But you have high density populations in the southern part of the region. So what we're seeing is that individuals are accumulating in the wintertime in the low elevation, milder climate southern part of the region, and they've left the more mountainous, colder northern part of the region. Now, the titmouse is simply a single example of species that do things like that. there are a number of species that wind up accumulating toward the coast in winter. And when you consider the community as a whole, therefore, species richness is greatest in those areas that have the highest temperature and lowest in those areas that have the coldest temperature. Now, one last issue I can bring up under this heading of communities in niches is what goes on in this system right here. This is a freshwater marsh, one of a series of freshwater tidal marshes that occur along the lower Connecticut River. It's another area that I've worked for quite a number of years. In fact, probably more years than most of you have been alive. It's a very interesting system, in part because it's a much simpler kind of a community. There aren't that many species of animals, specifically birds, that live in these freshwater wetlands. And so it's an area that you can investigate another aspect of species richness. Let's take a look at one of the species that lives here. This is a Virginia rail, which is one of these bizarre sorts of creatures that live in these marshy habitats. Rarely flies, rarely see it at all. It just slinks around among the vegetation, more like a mouse than a bird. And it plus its other community members have some interesting patterns in terms of their distribution in this system. Species like this Virginia rail will occur in rather small patches of wetland, but as the patches get smaller, its occurrence becomes more and more problematic. It might occur, it might not occur. That wetland photo that I just showed you, it actually lives in that place. That is a wetland of only about 10 or so acres, but in other 5 to 10 acre wetlands it's not present, whereas in large wetlands it's pretty much always there. And that pattern is repeated again and again with some of its community members. And that raises an issue. Let's take a look at a graph that's related to this. So what we see here is a graph that shows that as the area of habitat increases, the number of species present, the species richness of that site increases. Now these are my data from the Connecticut River, gathered, as I said, over a period of quite a few years. This is a pattern which is well known in community ecology. It's referred to as the species area effect, and it's been known about for well over 100 years now. It is often described as one of the few laws of community ecology. The existence of this pattern is such a well-documented phenomenon. However, scientific laws simply describe patterns. They don't explain the cause of those patterns. And so that was the purpose of my investigation, was to figure out what gave rise to this. And in a simple community like a marsh community where there are relatively few species, one can investigate in detail what goes on with each species. So what I discovered was that the pattern appears in part simply due to common sense kinds of things. What you find is that species that need larger areas are pretty much restricted to those large areas. If an area is not sufficient in size to support them, then the species is not present. Things like ducks and herons and big birds require big areas in order to live, and so they are effectively excluded from small sites. But of course, in nature things are never quite that simple. So there are other species like that Virginia rail, which is a relatively small bird, that occurs in large sites pretty consistently, but inconsistently at small sites. And we can relate that to random kinds of population factors, local extinctions due to random events, so that it's not going to occur at some of these small sites every year just because of chance, even though it recognizes the habitat is suitable and is capable of occupying even a small site. Other species were still more problematic in terms of how they distributed themselves among sites. Another bird, the marsh wren, is a tiny little bird, doesn't require a very big territory in order to make a living, and yet it was pretty much always absent from smaller sites. And I think that we can explain some of that kind of phenomenon by investigating the species' behavior. Does it recognize a small area as suitable? You can think of wild animals as having an internal vision of what a suitable place is, and if a site doesn't meet that internal vision, they simply don't choose to settle there. And I think that is likely what goes on with the marsh wren. It simply doesn't recognize some of these habitats, some of these small habitats, as suitable. And so it just never sets up shop there. And year after year after year, I'd see the same thing, even though there was plenty of vegetation which appeared to be perfectly suitable for marsh wrens. It simply would never occur at these sites. And so with that as still another kind of a insight into the nature of communities and niches, let's come to an end of that topic, and we will investigate new things next time.